Hello friends, and welcome to another Disability Dramaturgy Deep Dive. I'm so glad to have you. Today we are going to talk about Porgy and Bess, which is an opera that I bought a ticket to see at the Met because it's a name I've heard a lot of times before, and I figured it was probably worth seeing, and also the Met has like $25 tickets, so I figured why not, just to check it out. And then the ticket confirmation email appeared in my inbox, and it had a man center stage using a cane and wearing a leg brace, and I was like, I've gotten myself into a much larger project than I intended to. I also think it is notably interesting that I did not know that this show centers itself around a disabled man until now, and what that might say about intersectionality in literature around theatrical disability. I know this particular show is weird because it is both musical theater and opera. That may be a large part of why I didn't quite know about it, but it is still very noteworthy. Now, lots of housekeeping things to get out of the way before we jump in. Hi, I'm Cindy. My pronouns are they, them. I am a performer and disability historian. I make videos about disability or disability adjacent stuff in science, history, education, and media. And in this specific series, we break down shows that either implicitly or explicitly involve disability to academically demonstrate that disabled stories have always been a part of the media canon and always will be, work on our critical thinking and media analysis skills, and talk about ways to more ethically stage and talk about these shows, always with a cool "that happened, now what" mindset that doesn't point fingers at any specific individuals, but instead lovingly pushes the industry forward and unpacks the fundamentally flawed system on which it was built. If you want to support me monetarily, my Patreon is linked below, along with the social list for further reading and learning. And if you want to support me for free, you can do that by liking, commenting, and or subscribing. Zero pressure and all of the above. I just like to remind you that those things exist. I'm also currently planning a trip to London for some academic shenanigans, and so if you want to monetarily support me, that would be greatly appreciated. For friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown curly hair that's just beyond shoulder length. I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has some green leaves and fairy lights directly above my head, and I'm sitting on a dark gray couch that you can see the top of, and I'm wearing a... colors. I'm wearing like a tan and brown and dark pink, red flannel. I tried my best. I'm so sorry. It is plaid. It is in those vague colors. And I have a tank top on underneath it that you cannot see because of the angle of the camera. I also want to note that some of this topic is out of my specific realm of academic expertise, in that Porgy sits on the line between musical theater and opera. I'm not the most versed in what the opera world looks like, and in that this is a show that has an entirely black cast, with the exception of 2 to 5 white people, depending on your version, and centers around Southern African American culture, more specifically that of the Gullah people from the early 1900s. The vast majority of the literature about Porgy interrogates its racial politics, mostly from black perspectives, so I'm deferring to collating those opinions and quoting those people as much as possible here rather than giving my own. And then I also had the pleasure of talking to truly the most people in the opera world. I did not know that many disabled opera people followed me, but I guess that makes sense, which included multiple disabled opera singers to cover that specific portion of this video as well. So hopefully that covers all of our bases. I care a lot about doing this analysis right, and hopefully I've at least somewhat succeeded. Also, one last thing. I'm sorry, I'm almost done. Porgy and Bess is a very heavy opera. It includes topics such as drug use, domestic violence, assault, racism, ableism, murder, and some outdated words relating to disabled people and black people will inevitably pop up and or be alluded to throughout this, but I'm going to do my best to talk about all of the above with as little information as necessary for the sake of analysis. If you're not in the space to hear about those topics today, that's totally fine. I have many other analyses of disability representation in theater that you can watch. I've linked that playlist below for you, and also probably above unless I ran out of cards already. Okay, that is everything. I'm so sorry. Let us jump in. So Porgy and Bess is considered a folk opera with music by George Gershwin and libretto by DuBose Hayward and Ira Gershwin. If you're not familiar with Gershwin lore, they're brothers. Ira is 2 years older. And it really sits on the line between musical theater and opera. Even today, nobody really quite knows how to classify it. When it first opened on Broadway, many publications sent both their opera reviewers and their theatrical reviewers and then published both reviews simultaneously because they didn't know what to do with it. It is traditionally technically an opera by definition, in that it is sung through. Well, sometimes, we'll get to that, but it is very jazzy and Gershwin-y, so it sounds a lot like what we think of older like Broadway musicals, and it can be and has been performed in many different kinds of vocal tone anywhere along the continuum of musical theater to the operatic, which does not help the classification issue. The thing that is most notable about this opera, beyond the fact that it is Gershwin's only opera, as George would die very suddenly a few years after, is it's often viewed as the first American opera. It's more technically the second than it is the first, but it is much more famous than the other one, so argue about that in the comments if you like. It also has virtually an entirely black cast, something that is a requirement of its licensing from the Gershwin estate. And there have been some big controversies of people trying to do it in blackface or otherwise without black people altogether. That has been a whole thing. We're not going to get into that history today. But one thing I did find really interesting is that in 1965 they expanded the requirements to say that Maori opera singers are also allowed to perform this opera for the New Zealand production, which I think is pretty cool. It will also enter the public domain in 2030 or 2031, meaning that the estate no longer has control over its licensing and how it is performed. And that will sure be an interesting day when that happens. Especially considering a certain Aida has been performing that role in blackface as recently as 2022, but I digress. The opera is based on a play that is based on a book published in 1925 titled Porgy by author DuBose Hayward. DuBose is a very interesting figure. He grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, technically descended from a prominent aristocratic white family, but in this era all of Charleston was very, very poor, and thus his family was as well. I would personally classify him as disabled, actually, at least for a portion of his life, because he spent most of his childhood consistently bedridden with various illnesses, at least one of which turned out to be polio, but they rarely knew what he was actually sick with. His mother, a writer and amateur historian who worked full-time after the death of her husband when Hayward was little, encouraged him to spend his time in bed reading and writing as much as possible. She herself spent her spare time chronicling the stories and dialects of the Gullas of the Carolina Barrier Islands. Hayward spent many hours outside of school working as a newsie for some years before he dropped out at age 14 and started to work full-time, initially as an employee at a cotton warehouse on the waterfront, which mostly employed local Gullah people. And don't worry if you're confused what that means, we're going to explain that in just a moment. Now, I was unable to corroborate this specific fact with a second source, but I do want to include it anyway because it's interesting if it is true, which it very well might be. There's not a lot of information on this man. Like many white children growing up after Reconstruction, Hayward was raised by an African-American mama and may have learned Gullah before learning English. All of which to say he was very much surrounded by this community and it impacted how he saw the world. Now, the word Gullah is used to both describe a group of formerly enslaved people living in the Sea Islands, which are like a chain of small islands on the coast of South Carolina and Georgia and a little bit of Florida, and the language that they speak, which is a Creole that's a combination of West African languages, English, and some of the local indigenous American languages. This group of people have lived there since the late 1600s, mostly taken and enslaved from the coast of West Africa. The Gullah people of the Sea Islands were also involved in what has become known as the Port Royal experiment? I don't actually know which one. There's gonna be so many moments in this where you're gonna be like, wow, Sydney has only read books about this thing. During the Civil War in November of 1861, the Sea Islands were captured by the Union and the Confederates and local residents basically just like dipped, they abandoned it, and they left behind about 10,000 enslaved people and their plantations. And the Union didn't allow slavery, but it also didn't not allow slavery, and so by the rules of the war, the enslaved people became a weird in-between of enslaved and not enslaved, technically contraband of war, and it became a bit of a science experiment as to what freeing slaves en masse could look like, and it's often called the rehearsal for Reconstruction, and it had fascinating social implications for this specific community and for the overall Reconstruction that came later. Anyway, separate digression, I just thought that tidbit of history was very interesting. Now, Hayward grew up, maybe not in the Gullah community, he was a white kid, but pretty adjacent to it at the very least. After his time in the cotton warehouse and doing other odd jobs, he would create an insurance company, and then he would later give that up to become a writer. He met his wife, Dorothy Coons, at a writing fellowship in New Hampshire, and then they settled back in Charleston. If sources mention Dorothy Hayward at all, they call her a wannabe or budding playwright. I will have you know that she had a play of hers on Broadway in 1924, at a time when women playwrights were not very common, and she later had a few more, though none of them were incredibly successful. But she was a whole lot more of a playwright than DuBose was at the time, and let's not forget that. In the spring of 1924, DuBose saw a story in the paper about a disabled man who traveled via cart pulled by a goat. Specifically, that he had led a police chase in the goat cart. We'll save that story for the disability section. But fascinated by this story, he used that as inspiration to write his 6-part Porgy novella. And what made this book really important at the time is it was widely seen as one of the first novels that actually took African American culture seriously and with sympathy in any capacity. I will say, reading it, that makes you very concerned about what everything else looked like from the time, which I have not read those books in quite a while, so I don't actually remember. But sure. Great. If you put the everything about most of the characters aside, the way it's written is really lovely. And by the halfway point, I was pretty locked in as to what was going to happen, but it sure is a 1925 novel about race written by a white guy. It's clear that he had the best of intentions and did genuinely want to reflect their culture and language as best he could, but also he has written about how he thought the primitiveness of their culture was so beautiful and he wanted to preserve it on paper before it disappeared as they became more civilized. So there is that. But at the time, it was a very big deal and was fairly popular and generally well received as best I understand. Now at this point, Dorothy Hayward said, "Hey husband, I think this would make a great play. And also I've already written most of the adaptation of the play, so I know it's a good play and I hope that's cool with you and we should do something with it." And he was like, "Oh, Okay, sure. And so then they wrote the rest of the script together. The play in 4 acts would open at the Guild Theatre, what is now the August Wilson, on October 10th, 1927. It ran there and or also at the Republic Theatre, which is now the New Vic, until August of 1928. Both theaters are listed. I'm not sure if it moved, what happened there. I cannot find any information, but it definitely opened at the Guild at the very least. It was incredibly successful, and after the play closed on Broadway, it toured the United States twice, did 11 weeks in London, and then had another Broadway run from September to October of 1929. But then that one is listed as being at the Martin Beck, which is now the Al Hirschfeld, so I'm not sure where the Republic happened, to be quite honest, but sure, I wanted to include it since it's listed. Much like is famous with the opera version, the Haywards insisted that all Black characters be played by Black performers. This was not the first show on Broadway with Black people in roles, with the first integrated show being the 1921 Showboat, but it was the first serious dramatic work on Broadway to include Black actors. Long before the play ever opened, DuBose received a letter from George Gershwin saying, "Hey, I read your book, it's great, this needs to be an opera. I would like to make this an opera with you. Are you willing to make it an opera with me? Please, can we make it an opera?" And DuBose was like, "Hey, I'm not sure, we're kind of making a play right now." And George said, "No worries, there's room for all of the above. I'm gonna finish what I'm working on, you do the play, and then we'll be in touch." And so that's what they did. And in the summer of 1934, George Gershwin moved to a rented beach cottage on Folly Island for 6 weeks to work on composing his opera. He and Hayward spent a lot of time traveling to Black churches, going to local concerts, and trying to understand the sound of the local people to be able to capture it in the final piece. Porgy and Bess was first performed in Boston on September 30th, 1935, and then transferred to Broadway on October 10th, which is a very quick turnaround, at the Alvin Theatre, which is now the Neil Simon, and it ran for 124 performances. It was directed by Ruben Mamoulian, who had directed the play as well. You may know him as the guy who directed Carousel and Oklahoma. The first Porgy and Bess starred 20-year-old Anne Brown, the first African-American vocalist admitted to Juilliard, and Todd Duncan, who was a voice teacher at Howard University at the time, and would later become the first African-American to sing with a major opera company. Also, the original Sportin' Life was played by vaudevillian John W. Bubbles, who you may know as the father of Rhythm Tap. The story as to why the show ended up on Broadway rather than in an opera house is not the most clear. I've heard one historian say the Met specifically commissioned a Gershwin opera and said, "You can do whatever you want," and then when he said, "Great, this is what I want, we need to hire Black performers," they balked at it, and so he chose to do Broadway instead. I've heard that the Met heard he was working on an opera, just cause, I guess, and then they tried to pay him to premiere it there, and then the same thing happened. I've also heard that Gershwin himself refused the Met and decided to put it on Broadway, but either way, that is where it ended up. The very initial production was 4 hours long with 2 intermissions, and the Gershwins themselves made many cuts and changes, and as you'll see throughout the production history, there isn't really a standard version of Porgy and Bess to be had. There's always been cuts and changes being made. Ira also made some changes after George died. And then after Broadway, the opera would go on tour in 1936, which included it becoming the first integrated audience for any show at the National Theatre in Washington, D.C. due to a cast protest. It would not be performed in Charleston, South Carolina until 1970 after 2 failed desegregation attempts. Rather than take a lot of time to write the plot summary out, I'm just gonna read the one the Met Opera provided for me because it's pretty thorough and it's not often I get nicely published synopses of things I analyze on here, so why not enjoy it while it lasts? The setting is listed as Catfish Row, a tenement neighborhood of Charleston, South Carolina in the 1920s. The show is traditionally divided up into anywhere from 2 to 4 acts, originally performed with 2 intermissions, now typically with 1. This Met synopsis breaks it into only the 2 acts, as that's how this version is performed. I will personally split it into 4. The inhabitants of Catfish Row are relaxing after a day's work. Clara sings a lullaby to her baby. The drug dealer's Sportin' Life, Clara's husband Jake, and some of the other men are playing craps under the disapproving eye of the religious Serena. Jake sings a lullaby of his own to the baby. The disabled beggar Porgy arrives and is about to join the game when Crown and his partner Bess appear. The loudmouth Crown joins the dice game, drunk and high on drugs. The drug in this case is cocaine, but it's called happy dust. He loses, starts a fight, and kills Robbins with a cotton hook. Before the police arrive, Crown runs off to hide, telling Bess that he'll be back for her. The community shuns Bess as they await the arrival of the police. Sportin' Life offers to take her to New York with him, but she refuses. Only Porgy is sympathetic to her. He offers her shelter and his protection, which she accepts. In her room the following evening, Robin's widow Serena leads the mourners at her husband's funeral. A collection is being taken to meet the cost of the burial. Porgy and Bess enter, and Bess offers Serena a contribution, which at first she refuses, thinking it must be Crown's money. She finally accepts it when it's explained that it is Porgy's. The police officers arrive and accuse Peter, the honeyman, of the murder. Fearing what might happen, he tells them that Crown is responsible, but is himself promptly arrested as a material witness. Serena convinces the undertaker to bury Robbins for less than his usual fee. Bess leads everyone in an exultant spiritual. Then Act 2, but if you're splitting it into the 2 acts, this is technically it's still within the first half. A month later, Jake and the other fishermen are mending their nets. Porgy compares his life to theirs. Sport and Life enters, but before he has an opportunity to peddle any of his happy dust, Mariah, the matriarch of Catfish Row, chases him away. The lawyer, in quotation marks, Frasier sells Bess a divorce, even though she and Crown were never married. Everyone is preparing to leave for a church picnic on Kitawa Island. Sport and Life asks Bess again to come to New York with him and tries to give her more dope, which she refuses. Porgy threatens him and chases him off. He and Bess reflect on their newfound happiness. Porgy insists that Bess should go to the picnic without him. At first, she refuses, not wanting to leave him alone, but eventually she yields to his persuasion and joins the others as they set off. On Kitawa Island, the evening of the same day, Sport and Life describes his own cynical view of religion to some of the revelers. This is the song It Ain't Necessarily So, you've probably heard it before, until Serena chastises them for being taken in by his stories. The steamboat whistle announces that it's time to leave, and everyone starts to pack up their belongings. Bess hurries along until Crown, who had been hiding on the island since the Robbins murder, calls out to her. He wants Bess to come with him, but she explains that she now has a new life with Porgy. Crown forces her to stay with him. I should note here that it's not only that Crown forces her to stay, but that he is physically abusive, and it's very obviously insinuated that he assaults her, and that's basically when the curtain comes down before the second half. Now into Act 3. In Catfish Row, at dawn a week later, fishermen leave for a day's work at sea despite a storm warning. Bess is heard talking deliriously from Porgy's room. She has been feverish and ill since returning from Kitawa Island. Peter, released from police custody that morning, advises Porgy to take her to the hospital, but Serena would rather pray for her recovery. Her prayers are answered. Bess emerges into the courtyard free of the fever. She explains to Porgy that she wants to stay with him, but that when Crown returns, she'll be forced to go back with him. And Porgy tells her that she doesn't have to go with Crown, and he and Bess reaffirm their love for each other. The wind begins to rise and the hurricane bell sounds. At dawn the following day, everyone cowers together in Serena's room and they pray for deliverance from the storm. Suddenly there is a knock at the door. It's Crown seeking shelter and looking for Bess. She won't go with him, insisting that she belongs to Porgy alone. He mocks Porgy and the frightened townspeople and counteracts their prayers for deliverance with a vulgar song. At the storm's height, Clara sees Jake's boat has overturned and rushes out to save her husband. Bess calls for one of the men to go after her, and Crown is the only one to respond. I'm gonna put the break for Act 4 here. I've seen it placed in a couple places. This is just where it's logical for me. In Catfish Row, the following night, the storm has passed. The women grieve for those who have been lost, including Jake, Clara, and it is assumed Crown. Sport and Life appears, mocks their weeping, and hints that Crown is still alive. Bess is seen at the window, lulling Clara's baby to sleep. Under the cover of darkness, Crown steals in and approaches Porgy's door, but Porgy is ready for him, strikes the first blow, and kills him. The next afternoon, the detective returns to Catfish Row, accompanied by the coroner. They're investigating Crown's murder, but their questioning of Serena and two other women draws a blank. They go to Porgy's room and tell him he must come with them and identify Crown's body. Horrified that he must look at Crown's face, Porgy refuses to go and has to be dragged off. Taking advantage of Porgy's absence, Sport and Life tries to convince Bess that Porgy will be locked up for certain, and he attempts to lure her away to a new life. When Bess spurns him, he forces some dope on her and leaves more outside her door as he leaves. A week later, the inhabitants of Catfish Row greet each other at the beginning of another day. Porgy returns from jail in a jubilant mood. He distributes gifts he has bought with the money he won playing games of crap in jail. He is unaware of his friend's discomfort as he calls out for Bess. Eventually, Serena and Mariah tell him that Bess has gone to New York with Sport and Life. Hearing this, Porgy decides to follow her. He cannot live without Bess. The show often closes with Porgy either hobbling off into the sunset or riding his goat cart off into the sunset in a very bittersweet way. Now, trying to find precisely when the show is actually supposed to take place is a bit of an adventure. Most sources will tell you that it takes place in the year of its publication, 1925. The book itself opens with Porgy lived in the Golden Age, not the Golden Age of a remote and legendary past, nor yet the chimerical era treasured by every man past middle life that never existed except in the heart of youth, but an age when men, not yet old, were boys in an ancient beautiful city that time had forgotten before it destroyed, which gives us very little information. The hurricane in the story is in reference to the 1911 hurricane there that was so devastating it killed off the entire rice industry of the area, so I would be inclined to say that this show takes place in 1911-ish, which would also explain the sheer amount of alcohol without any commentary on it being prohibition. But then the other event it's loosely based on is from the news article in 1924. Beside the point, it takes place somewhere between 1910 and 1925, let's say. Catfish Row is based on the actual Cabbage Row, a slum-like tenement on Church Street in Charleston, close by to where Hayward had grown up. And Porgy is based on a real guy by the name of Samuel Goat Cart Sam, or Goat Sammy Smalls. And I wish I could tell you this man was super cool and like an unsung historical disabled icon. I fear he does not come across fantastically in the historical record. Smalls was best known as the singing panhandler in the goat cart with the angelic voice, she said, but at the end of the day, he'd leave downtown and return to the Charleston Neck area where he gambled and beat women with his goat whip. He would beg and sell peanuts, usually at the corner of King and Broad Streets, and he got around via a cart pulled by a goat, who would stand dutifully outside waiting for him while he gambled. He was known for being cruel and unkind and often drunk, a ladies' man and heavy gambler, and the specific story that turned into Porgy was that he was arrested on March 24th, 1924 for trying to shoot a woman named Maggie Barnes. He'd also been arrested some months earlier on a similar charge, and then leading a police chase via goat cart. He stayed in jail until June 3rd when the charges were dismissed. Struck by the incident, Hayward later recalled having commented at the time, "Just think of that old wreck having enough manhood left to do a thing like that." A link between being disabled and possessing manhood. Something to shove in our back pocket for later. The goal of tracking down this information about Goat Cart Sam was mostly to figure out what was actual fact, since he was seemingly well known within the community, so there's a solid chance Hayward knew about him in more depth beyond what this news story said when writing about him, and then what came from Hayward's imagination itself, because sometimes we see stereotypes arise in media that are actually reflections of reality, and I wanted to give credit where it's due. I unfortunately was not able to find very much information, especially about the nature of his disability, since most everything just refers to him as crippled. A few articles said he was unable to stand up. 2 other sources said he didn't have any legs. Maybe. It's kind of about half and half in the existing literature. Along with a widely circulated image I will put on the screen of a random child with his goat cart, but no images of him. Likely because he parked his cart outside the gambling house and spent entire days in there, so there was ample time for cart and goat related shenanigans without him present. Author Dr. Kendra Hamilton wrote a book titled Romancing the Gullah in the Age of Porgy and Bess that has a section where she talks about what she heard about Samuel Smalls from some local women. The first quote, for example, was one of them. A lot of it echoes the things that we've already said here, but one new piece was a quote from jazz performer Ethel Waters' autobiography that described him as a short, stocky man with no legs and enormous strength in his hands and arms, which I am inclined to trust as the most primary source definitive description for what his disability might have been. This of course does not tell us whether he was born without legs or had very small ones that never grew, where potentially existing legs stopped, like it was like at the thigh or the knee, or if they weren't visible at all, or if it were due to some sort of accident or something. Not that this speculation is necessarily helpful in telling us more about Porgy as a character. I'm just always interested in disability and history, so when I find a person, I want to know. At some point, locals realized he'd been missing for a while, and so they tried to figure out where he had gone, ultimately finding a grave on James Island where apparently he'd had a wife named Normie, and she had said that the goat refused to eat after Sam had died. He died a year before the novel came out. He also told his wife that Maggie Barnes had stolen his watch, and that is why he shot at her. Who's to say if that's true? Very quickly after the book gained popularity, locals began to mix up stories from Porgy with the actual reality of Sam and to call him Porgy. I get a sense that there is some remaining oral history that is completely left untouched by the scope of my research. I really wasn't able to track down that much stuff. It all was pretty dead end heavy, but I think it's still enough for us to work with here for the purposes of what we're doing today. Now I want to pause the disability and I want to talk about the racial conversations around Porgy and Bess first, because I think that better sets up the intersectionality of it. We're going to start with a reel from the creator Babatunde_hip-hopera. He's fantastic. Everybody go follow him. He talks a lot about the classical music world in a very accessible way. I will need to crop some of this video out just to be super safe on the copyright side, so apologies for that piece being choppy, but the rest is completely untouched.
Did you know that the first really successful black opera was written by 2 white guys, Ira and George Gershwin? It was called Porgy and Bess, and when this opera dropped, it banged hard. It did really well, but it's complicated. The opera premiered in 1935, and one of the things that was unique about it, besides the fact that the Gershwins set it in Charleston, South Carolina, and that all the roles were played by black people, is the fact that the Gershwins insisted that all the roles be played by black people. It's in the copyright. To this day, if word gets out that you're putting on a production of Porgy and Bess without an all-black cast, and trust me, it'll get out, there's a good chance you're gonna hear from the legal team of the Gershwin Foundation. Now, you would think us black opera singers love this opera. It's complicated. On one hand, it was one of the first big operas to center black life and community. However, we're on the same stages where our other colleagues are playing these grand royal figures, and some of us didn't like having to play struggle. Because it is a black story written by white people, so it's gonna have some issues. In this case, stereotypes of poverty, violence, and drug use. So while it did open some doors, it also reinforced some negative imagery. Speaking of opening doors, there are also a bunch of stories of black opera singers that couldn't even get an audition until that company needed to put on a production of Porgy and Bess, and that ended up being that singer's way to the stage where they could finally be heard, and sometimes it launched their careers. It's complicated. You know the other thing that's real funny? Different operas have different levels of success. Porgy and Bess almost always sells out everywhere, every time. So it is noteworthy that the opera is rarely performed. They say that it's because it's difficult to get a full cast of black opera singers, but that's not true. There are thousands of us, and we all know each other, and we all tell each other whenever anyone is doing Porgy and Bess. So sometimes it looks like they're avoiding putting on that opera until they absolutely have to. You know, we all have this joke where we can kind of tell if an opera company is struggling because they finally put on a production of Porgy and Bess, because a lot of them use it to get back in the black. But since 1935, one thing has been true. That opera is a banger, wildly entertaining, and it's given the pop and jazz world songs like "Summertime and the Living is Easy." You know that's from this opera, right? So yeah, that's a bunch of fun facts about Porgy and Bess. Now, remember how I said the whole black cast thing was under copyright and US copyright law lasts about 95 years, and this opera was premiered in 1935, which means Porgy and Bess will enter the public domain in around 2031. And after that, anyone can do it, not just black people. So there are already some big conversations around this. Who gets to perform it? Who can perform it? Who should perform it? Because it's complicated. It's not just music, it's about identity and ownership and who gets to represent black life. I mean, what do you think? Come 2031, should Porgy and Bess still only be performed by all black cast, or should it be open to anyone who can sing it? You know what I think.
The one thing I do want to push back on isn't quite the right word, but one piece of historical context that is important and makes this maybe a little bit more complicated or otherwise nuanced, or at least interesting, is the fact that while the Haywards were definitely white by the standards of that era and by modern standards, the Gershwins were first-generation Russian Jewish Americans, which at the time wasn't quite considered right, and the director Ruben Mamoulian was an Armenian immigrant from what was the Russian Empire at the time that he left it. They definitively wrote and produced this opera from an inherently paternalistic lens. The amount of times I read and or had to listen to the phrase primitive Negro used in what they thought was the positive over the course of this research process made me want to bash my head into a wall. So I'm not saying that they're not still definitely outsiders looking in on and trying to represent a culture they're very much not a part of. That critique will continue to come up over and over again throughout all of history. But what I am saying is that this time period is when the melting pot idea of this happy-go-lucky interconnected America was at its strongest, and that, as well as the immigrant status of some of the creative team, is important context for that. There was this focus at the time on trying to decide what America's culture actually is. We had just last minute jumped into a world war and were kind of a huge piece of why it was won, very much elevating America as a global power and increasing nationalism internally, and nationalism requires a sense of these are the things that are uniquely us. These are the things that make us us. So then people had to start figuring out, well, what is uniquely American? What is us? And then whose art also gets to be included in that? The late 1900s and early 1930s gave us the foundation of folk festivals and the archive of the American folk song for this reason, along with lots of discussions as to who actually gets to be part of that folk and what counts. Also, the Harlem Renaissance is happening, an explosion of jazz is happening, a lot of culture is going on and intertwining and creating something new. We also know from our history of vaudeville, which I'll link above, that the melting pot very much made its way into those venues as well. It was seen as, well, everybody's an immigrant and has their quirks, so everything is fair game, meaning that just about everything was racist, but it was generally perceived, at least as the literature claims it was received at the time, that might not be entirely 100% the case, as fine because everybody was acknowledging each other's cultures and intertwining them. Over the course of a vaudeville show, you would see immigrants make fun of a different group of immigrants, and every group was represented at one point or another and were excited to be a part of it and see themselves represented in any capacity. That's obviously sort of an oversimplification, and some of that history, of course, comes with a rose-colored glasses view of things, and I'm sure many people back then also felt offended by these things. There just wasn't as much language for it or conversation around it, but that's the general idea. This era had a view of glorifying the melting pot and everything from anyone being fair game because we're all lowly immigrants here, but then also simultaneously the start of pushback as to what actually is fair game and who gets to tell what story. And George Gershwin spent a good amount of his time in the world of vaudeville, so it tracks that this is the mindset he's going to follow in creating this opera. That mindset is, again, paternalistic as hell, but I do think the context of how minority groups in general were treated by the arts and who counted as white at this time is important context for that. That being said, there's also the minstrelsy thing. I read an article or two at some point that argued that the general comedy poking fun at immigrants of different races in the sort of melting pot kind of way and minstrelsy are not too dissimilar, since they both involve dressing up as a race that you aren't for comedic performance reasons. And that may be true of how it was processed culturally at the time that we can't entirely know. But of course the power dynamics are entirely different. Immigrants performing as other immigrants and poking fun at other cultures is not the same as white people donning blackface to impersonate the people the country had formerly enslaved. Also, blackface minstrelsy has a much longer legacy than many of these other things that we were talking about that are more associated with vaudeville, minstrelsy being about 30 to 40 years older. Though of course minstrelsy was a huge piece of vaudeville, and that's what kept it alive throughout the vaudeville period that basically lasted until Porgy and Bess appeared. And other forms of minstrelsy have of course lasted beyond that. But noting Gershwin's connection to the world of vaudeville is an important piece in the puzzle of Porgy and Bess, specifically because that was a world where mining other cultures for inspiration for your art was super normalized, and where minstrelsy, including some black performers performing blackface minstrelsy, which is complicated, and all of the archetypes and narratives therein were also super normalized. Most of the archetypes we have for black people in media, even today, find their roots in the archetypes used in minstrelsy, because it's important to remember that vaudeville was the very first mass entertainment to exist. These troupes traveled the country, and everybody went to the shows and knew all of the acts, and they were constantly cycling through. Not to directly quote another video of mine, but it was the first thing to treat commercial amusement as something people might want to partake in on the day-to-day, and thus made ticket prices extremely low to encourage return customers. It was also often continuous throughout the day, so people could go whenever. And for many people, especially Northerners, the minstrelsy that appeared in their touring vaudeville shows was the first time they'd really come across black people, or a poor facsimile of black people. Much like how we've talked about freak shows being the only way two entire generations ever came in contact with disability, because the rest of it was in institutions. And that's going to significantly impact how they view that minority going forward. All of which to say, Porgy and Bess has a lot of minstrel archetypes in it, just framed through a lens of supposed authenticity because they're played by black people. Professor and author Dr. Naomi Andre, in a talk called Porgy and Bess: A Black Perspective, which is on YouTube for free, you should go watch it, pointed out various archetypes that we see in the show. Bess looks a lot like the Temptress or the Jezebel. Porgy is a mix between the Uncle Tom, who's like the gentle and always good older man, and the Sambo, the happy-go-lucky, non-threatening man. Sportin' Life is similar to the Buck character, who's hypersexualized and going after all of the women, and I would also argue he fits into the Zip or the Dandy with his arrogance and constant style and trying to sound distinguished and fancy. In a PBS interview, Susan Laurie Parks refers to the one scene where Mariah pushes Sportin' Life around as being a fight between the mammy and the dandy, and they deliberately tried to recontextualize that a bit for their production. Other stereotypes that come up that you may have noticed include a focus on superstition, treating the characters as childlike and helpless and unintelligent, the inter-community violence and poverty, and the drug use and references to sex work, to name the big ones. And I think comparing all the source material, the initial jump from the source material to the stage made those archetypes stronger, and the jump from play to opera did so even further. And there's some existential crisis somewhere in there to have about how things become inherently archetypal when put into a format like opera and musical theater, because those mediums almost always rely on archetypes, and so therefore is this an entrenchment of prejudice and ability to understand black characters solely through the lens of minstrel archetypes, or is it how the cookie just crumbled an adaptation that just looks not fantastic given its context? We're not going to venture down that rabbit hole today, but it is a thought I want to briefly bring up. But either way, there is an argument to be made that by having black people out of blackface playing these versions of minstrel archetypes, no longer in vaudeville houses that were beginning to be seen as lowbrow at this time, but on Broadway in a serious opera that was marketed as being an authentic portrayal of black life, Porgy and Bess is likely to some degree responsible for the way these stereotypes then became entrenched in everything else and seen as more legitimate. Not the only thing responsible, to be abundantly clear, but definitely contribute to that initial shift, given that it was viewed, at least from press releases, as being the first big thing, or one of the first big things, to regard this group of people with sympathy and respect and alleged authenticity. Generally, the tide of public opinion about the race relations in the show changed over the course of its life cycle. We'll talk about that a lot more in the production history section, but even initially there were some smaller concerns over racial stereotype appearing. Interestingly, many of them were focused more on class issues than anything. People seemed to care more that the characters were portrayed as poor than about like the drug use or anything else. In his 1926 review of the book, W.E.B. Du Bois lauded Hayward's sympathetic treatment of Charleston's black folk, but chastised him for ignoring the city's thriving black middle class. This discussion expanded further with the original play, which had mostly positive reviews, but this idea of stereotypes continues to appear more and more, and got even stronger once the opera premiered. The reviews in general were actually fairly mixed of the opera, to some degree assumed because nobody quite knew what it was, but generally white reviewers didn't love the music, loved the story, and black reviewers didn't love the story and criticized its stereotypes, but loved the music. Anne Brown's own father, while proud of her portrayal in the production as Bess, wasn't a huge fan of it for that reason. He did not like the stereotypes, and he talked about it with her. While there seemed to be a vibe of being happy about some attention being paid to their communities and having a mainstream place for them to demonstrate their talent, there was increasing concern in conversations around Porgy and Bess about the ability of white men's portrayals of black people to be anywhere close to accurate. The chapter quoted above noted that there was published concern from progressive black and white period critics. From their position, Gershwin and Hayward were about the business of transforming white fantasies of black sensuality, spirituality, and violence into a commodity that was marketable as entertainment for primarily white audiences. I think when we talk about these kinds of shows we now see as outdated, we assume that these things are seen as outdated today because we have bodies of literature on stereotype and issues in media, and we have wider understandings of these issues academically, but it's important to remember that the same conversations were happening back then too. They were noting the same things, even if it was maybe framed or explained a little bit differently than how we would discuss it today. Some pieces from more recent conversations that I saw that I want to make sure I include are concerned from the performers about pigeonholing in the show. There are some performers who have made their livings jumping from Porgy and Bess production to Porgy and Bess production and are very happy doing that because it's steady work, but there are just as many who are afraid to be in the show at all because they fear that they will never get offered any other role again. I forgot which Porgy interview it was. It was either from the Dr. Andre talk or from the Library of Congress 90th anniversary discussion of the work, but one of the performers talked about how he played Porgy once and was immediately offered 5 more Porgys. All of them talked about how they had to be deliberate in thinking about where the show would fit into their careers, if they wanted to fit it into their careers, fairly early on because of how easy it is to get pigeonholed within it and never do anything else. The same sentiment was also shared by Damon Evans in the 1998 Great Performances documentary on Porgy and Bess, who played Sportenlife in the Trevor Nunn production. He was offered to do it at the Met and he declined it, saying, "I saw too many brilliantly talented black singers go into the Met doing Porgy and Bess that were shown the exit sign as soon as it was over." He concluded that he would rather never sing on the Met stage than be treated like that, so he turned the role down. Also, Porgy and Bess might be revolutionary for having a stage full of black actors, but the vast majority of the time it's an all-white creative team behind the scenes, even up until today, which comes with its own discussion about the optics of inclusion versus actually making opportunities, and about how those directing a production about a community that is not their own can make the right decisions as to how to go about doing that. I know within the opera world, Porgy doesn't actually change a whole lot, so directorially there isn't a whole lot of wiggle room. We're going to talk about opera culture versus musical theater culture in handlings of this piece at the end, but it's still an issue. At the same time, I also don't want to sit here and say, yeah, this is all bad, let's throw it out, because there is a lot about it, as you saw from the reel that we started the section with, that's also kind of great. We have seen many performers talk about the feeling of walking into a room that's almost entirely black artists for the first time in their career and what that kind of community is like and how rare that is. Also, from an audience perspective, I've been to many a show with an all black or nearly all black or otherwise BIPOC cast, but theater does not tend to have more than 30 people on stage at once, and opera is opera. So this show has well over 75 black people on stage at one time, and seeing the curtain come up on that in and of itself just took me a while to sit with the fact I'd never seen anything like that before. There was one more recent Porgy who mentioned that he grew up in or near the Gullah community and how powerful it is not only to hear the language and sounds of his upbringing in any form of media, but specifically in an operatic setting. And then of course there's also the bittersweet, complicated fact of how the show is what has launched many careers, so it is very complicated. I think it's easy in any sort of critical analysis of a minority piece of media to hear all the critiques and say, cool, the bad outweighs the good, let's set it on fire and move on, just because usually critique has more to delve into and discuss than just, hey, that's cool and I liked it. In this particular case, obviously not my place to say whether we should keep it or set it on fire, but I want to make sure that we're remembering that this is complicated and this is nuanced within all of the critique that we're talking about today. And also, from what I know of media history and minority media history, this isn't really a piece that's going anywhere. There is no set it on fire, throw it out the window option. So remembering the positives and the nuances rather than just the critiques is probably fairly helpful. If you're on my channel and you've gotten this far in the video, I know you exist in the two things can be true kind of mindset, but sometimes it's good to remind ourselves of things like that. Another interesting critique of the show that I read was an article by a musicologist named Kai West, who analyzed white portrayals in the show. There's only 5 white people in the full unedited show, and they appear in only 3 moments. moments: the detective, 2 police officers, the coroner, and the lawyer. The only one who is ever named is the lawyer, whose name is Archdale, and West noted that all 3 of these interactions between the white characters and everybody else in the show are usually the first ones to be altered and or cut in any version of Porgy and Bess. In all the interactions between races, the white characters never sing. Gershwin said in an interview in 1934 that this is because, I'm sorry, with colored people there's always a song. They find something to sing about, versus white people who are more civilized. They are also more unemotional, drab, and dull. Which sure is a thing to have said out loud. That being said, some versions where they change the recitatives to dialogue, we lose some of the power of the deliberate difference between the two, especially in the scene near the end with the ladies singing together and trying to trick the officers into thinking they've been home ill and didn't know there was a murder taking place, which makes this narratively tricky in both directions. Also, the most frequently cut of the 3 interactions is Archdale, the paternalistic lawyer who appears and says he got Peter, the guy at the beginning they put in prison as collateral till they found Crown, out of prison. He specifically says he did it as a favor because old Peter used to belong to his family, and this line is the only outward reference to slavery in the entire show. So while maybe it's nice to cut the condescending paternalistic white savior lawyer dude and just have Peter come out of prison on his own, as is often narratively the case now, it is very notable that our one reference to, the reason all of these people are living the lives they're currently living and the legacy of that is scrubbed from the show in general. But that's also been noted for a very long time as probably the reason why Porgy and Bess is and has been so successful. The near complete omission of the white world is why, as James Baldwin said in his review of the film, Americans are so proud of the opera. It assuages their guilt about Negroes and it attacks none of their fantasies. Since Catfish Row is clearly such a charming place to live, there is no need for them to trouble their consciences about the fact that the people living there are still not allowed to move anywhere else. It's a story and a world white people can look in on and go, wow, how beautiful, how quaint, whatever they want to feel, and not have to address anything about how they might interact with these people in that world on the actual day-to-day. West also noted something that I noticed when I saw the opera as well, which is that during the curtain call, the white characters are often booed, characters that have more recently been portrayed more as caricatures of the old racist Southern than as real actual human people, as a way for the audience to distance themselves from the past and these racist caricatures, as if to say, oh, we're not like that anymore. That time is over, when categorically it isn't. The one last thing about this before we jump into the more disability-leaning piece of this analysis is a quote from Daphne Brooks' paper, A Woman is a Sometime Thing, Recovering Black Womanhood in Porgy and Bess. They reflected something that I had been thinking about through the process, which is about the choice to transcribe a language that is not otherwise written and a genre of music and sound that is not otherwise usually transcribed, with the acknowledgement that the way we transcribe music and language is very Western, and that in and of itself can be colonialism. No doubt, Hayward and the Gershwins walked a complicated line in the business of notating and transcribing Black vernacular sound, oscillating between notational violence and a fascination with the fetishistic reverence for audible Blackness that seemingly resists incorporation, what we might think of as a kind of Derridian archival violence that shelters, preserves, and presents itself as revealing, even as it conceals histories of subjugation. I did an analysis in high school on some of the supposedly African folk songs often performed by children's choirs in the United States and everywhere else, and where they actually derive, many of them being European tunes that were transported via the slave trade to African nations, then picked up by locals who heard them whistled and hummed on slave ships, and then turned into local songs that then musicologists came to transcribe and market as African cultural music to the rest of the world, as well as bringing those transcribed songs back to African countries and teaching them to local children's choirs that were formed within the colonial education system structured solely for teaching skills of servitude to continue the cultural stratification by race. All of which sort of flattens and regurgitates culture back at the people it was taken from and says, hey, here, this is authenticity. We are representing you and your culture. You should be grateful for it. As if the process of getting it from where it was to where it is now did not strip half of the life from it. Now, I might turn that into a video someday. I've never seen it covered anywhere else, so I want to, but I don't feel like it's my place, so I have not touched it. But I did give a 90-minute presentation about it in high school. Either way, that concept was very much brought up for me here. I don't think Porgy and Bess is quite the same scenario because it's more of an original piece, but I very much think the violence of transcription and the flattening of what its actual roots are and meaning are still stands. And also apologies if I just ruined Shoshalloza for you, but it had to be done. But let's jump into the intersectionality of race and disability in this work. Before learning about the existence of Samuel Smalls, my immediate assumption as to the why of why Porgy was made disabled in the story is because disability is often utilized as a tool to emasculate and infantilize characters, and so I assumed the narrative choice to demonstrate, oh, Crown is scary and Porgy is the nice guy from the very start was to make him disabled. I was of course a bit thwarted by this assumption, by the existence of Goat Sammy, but that in and of itself is still incredibly telling. If we are going under the assumption that Hayward had never once run into this man on the street begging and didn't know any of the local commentary about him, only knowing about him from that one newspaper article, which said Samuel Smalls, who was a cripple and is familiar to King Street with his goat and cart, was held for the June term of Court of Sessions on an aggravated assault charge. It is alleged that on Saturday night he attempted to shoot Maggie Barnes at number 4 Romney Street. His shots went wide off the mark. Smalls was up on a similar charge some months ago and was given a suspended sentence. Smalls had attempted to escape in his wagon and had been run down and captured by the police patrol. And then, as we said earlier, he reportedly said, just think of that old wreck having enough manhood left to do a thing like that, and began writing a story where he then split what that newspaper clipping said of Smalls into 2 categories: evil and assault against women and a disabled man. And then wrote them as a non-disabled, violent man and a wholly sympathetic, wholesome, soft, emasculated disabled man fighting over a woman, is rather telling of what Hayward's view of the world was. The idea of manhood and emasculation and power is really important in looking at this character, though, because beyond the fact that disability is often utilized to make a character seem like less of a threat in many regards, it's also a really central through line in Porgy's character arc. Crown and Sport and Life both make fun of Porgy for not being a real man, and many times throughout the show he is referred to not as a man, but as a cripple. To be clear, I'm fine with that language being used in this particular case because historically it makes complete sense. Cripple is generally considered a slur today. I know not everybody still knows that, but it is interesting that up until very recently, all of the academic literature in the show has also only referred to him using that word, which feels dubious at best. But anyway, Porgy is very worried about not being man enough for Bess, and is teased about that by many other people over the course of the piece. But what I also find very notable is the moment he finally feels like a man, and he yells, "Bess, you got a man now, you got Porgy." I'm assuming this to mean that manhood is defending one's woman, but it's also interesting that he doesn't feel like a man until he has murdered a person. We have this reading of power intertwined with that, where before the 1980s, the vast majority of Porgies are portrayed as on their knees, if not completely army crawling across the floor. It wasn't until a lot more recently where we see Porgy with canes and leg braces and being at least somewhat mobile on his feet, which puts him closer to eye level with Bess and Crown. There's also a reading of Porgy lacking manhood that assumes sexual dysfunction. The story frames him as meant to be alone, something he says himself, that God makes cripples to be lonely or something along those lines. And then when he does get with a woman, she is someone who's assumed to be a sort of harlot who's trying to become a proper woman now that she's away from Crown, giving up the things that she did before. It's explicit that she gives up drugs and that she dresses more modestly, but there's also an implication that she is no longer promiscuous, for lack of a better word, as if by choosing Porgy she has chosen chastity and purity. This is also often implied by showing Porgy's room as only having a twin-sized bed. They explicitly balance this out in the 2011 script as a way to prevent this interpretation, which I loved. We will talk about that when we get to it. Another disabled trope that we see with Porgy is that he is assumed to be more connected to God and more inherently spiritual because of his disability, in line with truly one of the oldest disability stereotypes of like the pure, innocent, wholesome disabled saint. During the funeral, he's the one who gives a sort of sermon, and it's clearly not a new thing for him. And there's also a line where he says he knows that Bess has been with Crown when she was on the island, and she's like, how do you know that? He basically says God gives cripples things he doesn't give to strong men, insinuating that because he is disabled, he knows more about things than the average person, which is a line that has been brought up in literature a few times as being an inherent narrative problem. I also want to go back for a moment to the intersectionality of race and disability, because outside of the media has decided black men are threatening, so we're making this one disabled to make it clear that he's super isn't emasculation. The double infantilization of this character being black and disabled comes up throughout this work. Specifically in the recent Met production, the coroner spoke to Porgy very slowly and very loudly in a way that clearly assumed that this physical disability indicates mental disability as well and further treats him like a child. There are many moments where our villains, or even the people we just briefly dislike, assume him less intelligent than everybody else present to assume they can like get one over on him because of his disability status. There's also an interesting script tidbit where one of the white men refers to Porgy as a dummy in the derogatory, dummy at the time being a derogatory term for somebody who is deaf and non-speaking and assumed intellectually disabled. And what's interesting about that is the actual word originally in the libretto in that moment is the N-word. Dummy is the word offered as the alternative and is the one most often utilized, which both undercuts the racism of the moment because you're not hearing this harsh slur that we all know to be harsh, and increases the ableism, both by using a slur for a disabled person instead, and by using one people don't tend to realize is just that, which greatly softens the viewing experience for audience members. I've seen some scholars think that this change is great. I've seen many others think that this change is actively trying to hide the racism at hand for the comfort of white audiences. Let me know your thoughts on the matter, because it may only be a singular word change, but it has massive implications, and I find that quite interesting. We also need to talk about the fact that he's a beggar. Obviously, this piece is based in reality, so I'm not necessarily critiquing the fact that he is one, but it is interesting how when staged, we see Porgy during the day often, and he's just at home, doing nothing. Like, we hear in theory that he's a beggar. It's almost implied of like, well, of course he is. He's disabled. What else is he gonna do? But we never actually see him go off and do that. And this is a weird time for visible disability in American history, since the 1910s and 1920s were peak institutionalization and ugly laws, where being seen out in public with a physical disability of any kind was illegal and put you at risk for institutionalization, and most people in their day-to-day life never ran into any disabled people because of how many were living in institutions. And when they did run into disabled people, they were usually beggars. We get the word handicap from this, meaning hand in cap, as beggars often were. So as annoying as it is to see that reflected here, first of all, it's not atypical in the theatrical canon for disabled people to be beggars. There's an inherent theatricality to it, especially if they're old and wizened and all-knowing saintly people left behind by society, which Porgy kind of isn't, but some of that vibe still fits. And secondly, it is reflective of the person on which it was based, but it is of course a stereotype in its own right, so worth bringing up. I do wish that we could see Porgy doing literally anything else. Like, what if he's good with his hands and instead of sitting out there begging, he's selling baskets he's woven or wood that he has whittled or something like that? Give the man a skill set, like something to do. Not that resting or doing nothing means a person is not worthy or useful, to be abundantly clear, but this particular narrative almost wants to frame him as lazy and helpless and not capable of doing anything on his own, and like taking away from other people. And I think giving him something else to do would give him some much needed agency, especially because it is a bit weird that suddenly he cares and wants to try when a woman comes around, and that's when he starts to stretch himself, you know? Like, I don't know, what if a disabled person decided to live the life they wanted without needing some sort of lover to expand out their world for them and show them something new? A concept. Outside of Porgy, there are also other disability conversations at play here, a primary one being that Bess has a facial difference canonically. In the book, her description includes an ugly scar marked her left cheek, and yet the only time I've ever seen that represented in any production was the 2011 Audra McDonald Bess. If we are choosing to narratively acknowledge that Bess is disfigured, this opens up a lot of questions around desirability. Does she stay with Crown for so long because she is convinced due to her disability he's the only man who will ever want her? Is her finding her true love in another disfigured person some sort of, oh, only those people can be together situation? Does this extend into this implied chastity of their relationship about how those people shouldn't procreate? Because we haven't really gotten into the eugenics that is showing Black people as intellectually and socially inferior, particularly at a time where poverty was seen as the result of genetic inferiority rather than societal issues. There's also implications for what it means to have more than one physically disabled principal character in a piece of media, because that inherently balances our stereotypes differently. I usually describe this as the dilution of a stereotype, because it shows you more than one kind of disabled person, meaning the personality traits each character has can be seen as individual personality traits rather than directly intertwining with their disability. And I think to some extent, the 2011 version, this is the case, but they also made a lot of rewrites, so it's kind of hard to point to any specific factor as being purely responsible, if that makes sense. But I will say there are some versions where one of the elder people in the community also uses a cane, and it does majorly offset some of the, oh, Porgy's the helpless one in the community that we care for energy, because we see them do the same for this other man as well. The other disability thing in the show is acknowledging that addiction and alcoholism are disabilities that clearly impact this specific community. And so what does it mean to acknowledge that Crown too is disabled? We can also expand this discussion even further to acknowledge that any sort of marginalization is disabling, because society impacts one's ability to engage fully in the world without barriers, and thus everybody on the stage is technically disabled, with the exception of the white guys, just with different levels of support needs and normalization within their community. Hi, it's Editing Sydney here. I also wanted to add to this that because of the time period, the specific group of people is very recently connected to enslavement. They're like 1 or 2 generations out, right? And obviously, slavery is an inherently disabling concept because you are taking away all of the rights of a person and no longer making them a person, but also because of the jobs they were doing without any sort of safety equipment, and because of the common use of corporal punishment, that in and of itself also disabled many people. And specifically, we're talking about the Port Royal experiment. A large portion of the enslaved folks that were left behind when the Confederates ran were the disabled ones, because the people who fled took some of their enslaved folks with them and they left many behind. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that this group of people that we are seeing in the show, especially within the group of elders, should have been more disabled than what we tend to see on this stage. And I think that is interesting that it's never even remotely acknowledged. I mean, of course, slavery isn't even really remotely acknowledged. But the corporeal legacy of slavery on the bodies of these people would very much still be present within this community in this time period. And that is just not ever addressed or visually addressed. We still remain with only saying, yeah, Porgy's the disabled one, and maybe Bess is too if we actually think about it. And that just feels like a huge glaring omission to me that I wanted to make sure I mentioned. Again, I overall was kind of bummed by how little literature and discussion of this particular subsection of the show I was able to come across, especially because so much of what I read is so recent. So it feels notable that there is so much focus on one minority status and very little commentary on the other. I hope that body of literature will grow, but honestly, who's to say? I do feel like all I can really do here is like pose questions and things to think about, because there isn't really otherwise literature or production history to show what these things might mean or might look like in alternate versions. It's just like a complete academic gap, which is deeply strange. But now we're at the moment you've all been waiting for, that moment being our favorite game on this channel, and that is Adaptation Bingo, where we do a production history. But also, I watch every single one of them that I can get my hands on to give you a first-hand account. I found generally very little changes between versions, not unlike we went through with A Christmas Carol. My favorite, where everything sort of deferred to the standard and didn't expand much upon it, but the historical context around each version and how it was perceived is what makes this most interesting, at least for me. We're going to start with the 1925 book. A lot of the lines wrote down regarding Porgy's disability made their way into the script and eventual libretto, so there is not a lot to add here, but there is discussion of his begging, which is severely lacking in the staged versions of the story. Again, I feel like once it's staged, there's this sort of assumption that because he is disabled, he must be a beggar, and it's only mentioned a handful of times, but in the book it says, "So was Porgy equipped by a beneficent providence for a career of mendicancy," which basically means he was specifically built as a human for begging. But he's also not like other beggars, either by birth or through the application of a philosophy of life that is at the same time interested and subtly disturbed. Porgy sat silent, rapt. He also apparently never smiled. He just stared at people with his large eyes. I don't have specific page numbers for the quotes because the only digitized version I could find is from Project Gutenberg, but this is all the first couple pages of us getting to know this character. The story is framing it as, this dude is our main character. I'm gonna frame him through the lens of how you view beggars on the street, which is automatically a deeply interesting narrative choice. The text also specifies that nobody has any idea how old Porgy is or how long he has been begging there, but we do learn that this disability is something he has had since birth. He had, when he entered the world, totally inaccurate nether extremities, quick to catch the eye and touch the ready sympathy of the passerby. And again, this framing of him through the lens of sympathy, of pity, of emasculation. Not that we're surprised at this point. One notable thing about the book is that it's organized into 6 parts, whereas the play and opera will be combined into 4 acts. Also, the book ends with the goat cart chase written sort of farcically, followed by him learning Bess is gone and sitting there crying in devastation with his goat in the courtyard. It was Hayward's wife who came up with the idea of this new bittersweet ending when they were writing the play. The play also expands out Sportin' Life to be a much larger character. He's practically non-existent in the book. It changed the tone of the final interaction with the police, rather than the farcical goat chase going on, and it added Porgy choosing to go off after her end, which you can decide whether you think that's beautiful and romantic or foolish and tragic and dangerous, but it is more than just plain devastation at the very least. Regarding disability stereotype, 2 stage directions caught my eye that I just wanted to flag. The first is Porgy drives up to the gate in his soapbox chariot. He is a crippled beggar of the Charleston streets who has done much to overcome his handicap of almost powerless legs by supplying himself with a patriarchal and very dirty goat which draws a cart made of an upturned soapbox on 2 lopsided wheels. The language of overcoming disability is of note in the sense that he simply accommodated it for the specific setting, and then Porgy is no longer young and not yet old. There is suggestion of the mystic in his thoughtful, sensitive face. So again, we have this intersection of stereotype here with the idea of African Americans being particularly spiritual and mystic, but also with disabled people being closer to God and being able to see things others can't by nature of being disabled. Also, dramaturgy pro tip. If you're ever trying to figure out potential playwright bias, but it's hard because everything comes from the mouth of the characters, pay attention to the stage directions and the character descriptions because they will tell you a lot. Anyway, we've talked ad nauseum about the original opera from 1935, but regarding Porgy and disability specifically, just to be thorough, from extant photos, it seems like Porgy is on the floor the entire time. The first revival of Porgy and Bess was in 1942 at the Majestic Theatre, directed by Cheryl Crawford, where it ran for 9 months and then went on tour in 1944. People argue that this is the version of the show that actually made it a hit, whereas people didn't really know how to receive the original production. It seems like some major changes were made. There were significant cuts to expedite drama and make the flow of the story work better. Usually the hot topic around changes that comes up for all of them is what they do with the recitatives, which are like the sung pieces of dialogue. And in this particular production, depending on which report you read, they either turned all of them into spoken dialogue or they kept the ones that distinguish distinguish between the black and white characters and the ones that have certain important leitmotifs. Those are the like specific melodies that connect to each character of the piece, but then turn the rest of it into dialogue. Genuinely unclear, it's one of the two things. It was also marketed as a musical play, which is very interesting, and with this run expanding the show's popularity, we start to see criticism of its portrayal expand as well. I was only able to find one extant image of Porgy from this production that I can verify is from this production, and he is seated on a barrel or something, so I'm not sure what his mobility was or what it looked like in this version, but I would assume it is on his knees, as was the standard directly before and directly after this production. I've generally noticed that once there is a shift in Porgy's mobility in a famous version, all subsequent versions shift to using the new one, so I'm inclined to believe this stayed with the standard Porgy on the floor presentation. In March of 1943, Porgy and Bess had its European premiere in Nazi-occupied Copenhagen with all white performers in blackface. Everybody was kind of shocked that politically the show was allowed to go on at all, but it sure did. They ran for 22 performances and the Nazis closed it, and I'm not sure when the Gershwin estate began requiring all black casts for the show, but this is the only historical reference to it being performed by non-black people, with the, of course, exception of the 2018 Hungarian scandal that you can Google on your own time. This video is long enough. The first complete recording of the score would be made in 1951, and then in 1952 we had the extremely controversial Robert Breen production. This one is my favorite in the sense of the State Department gets involved, and it's kind of funny, not because I actually like it as a production. Basically, director Robert Breen wanted to emphasize the authenticity of the show, and he made edits to the libretto to try to reflect a more realistic portrait of Gullah life. Analytics have argued that those changes in fact leaned the characters even farther into becoming flat stereotypes, especially the villains, and made everybody else more childlike. This version also leans more theatrical than operatic, and many performers in this production were not really fans of the changes or how it was directed either. This Porgy is where I see what I call the scooter for the first time. If you've ever experienced gym class between like the late 90s to more recent history and played with the little wheelie scooters on the ground, I'll put a picture of them if you have no idea what I'm talking about. Many Porgies have something like that. It has like knee pads on top to be able to roll around while on their knees. I believe the shift to knee scooter happened in this production and it lasts for quite some time afterward. Now this version began its life in London, then traveled to New York City where it ran at the Ziegfeld Theater for some time, and then the United States State Department would decide this opera would make for really great Cold War propaganda, specifically to prove that capitalist countries have culture and also we're not that weird about race. Everything's fine. Black people can be totally successful here. So they threw a lot of money at it for it to go on an international tour. So explicitly for propaganda purposes that they literally said in their press release that the opera company was going to counteract propaganda of two kinds related to the United States. First, that this country has no real culture or native arts of creative vitality. Second, that the colored people have no opportunity to develop their abilities beyond a slave status. A separate quote says, "Well, admittedly good art, even better propaganda." Awesome. Now the fun part is that most of the people who came up with this idea, who greenlit it, who funded it, etc., had never actually seen the show and didn't know anything about its plot, just that it was American and it starred black people and that people liked it. So they then had to carefully craft a subsequent publicity campaign to hide what the show was actually about as much as humanly possible and instead focus exclusively on the cast and their glitzy travels around the world. They began in Vienna, then they went to Berlin, and over the course of 201 weeks from June 1952 to June 1956, they traveled to 29 countries on 4 continents. Also, Maya Angelou is in this production, I believe in the ensemble. So that's fun. The goal of the tour, unsurprisingly, slightly backfired. The reading of the critical press made a certain amount of sense in view of the State Department's first objective, which was simply to offer Europeans an experience of American art, but it flew in the face of its second goal, which was to counter direct Soviet charges regarding American cultural backwardness and racial cruelty. Generally, audiences seemed to come away with views similar to the original creatives around the beautiful primitiveness of African American culture and assumed the show was entirely factual, but also acknowledged these were very talented performers and maybe race relations probably aren't great in the United States given that all these characters are in poverty and many of them are on drugs. Somewhere in there, the State Department either ran out of money or stopped supplying money, but the Soviet Ministry of Culture really wanted to see Porgy and Bess, so they chose to fund the show to travel and perform in Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev, against the State Department's very openly known wishes, which again sort of implies the propaganda did not work super well given that the Russians were deciding to actively fund said propaganda coming to perform there. Their December 1955 premiere in Leningrad was the first American theater group there since before the 1917 revolution. Needless to say, since the point of this multi-year tour was just blatant propaganda, this put Porgy and Bess very much into the spotlight, leading to another flood of criticism about this opera. Especially because, again, Robert Breen made some changes to emphasize so-called authenticity in this version, which people had a lot of feelings about. Also, historical note here, in 1955, Marian Anderson became the first African-American in a leading role at the Metropolitan Opera, so we're also starting to see this cultural shift from, hey, it's cool we have this opportunity, to, hey, we're getting opportunities now, so let's revisit what we were grateful for because maybe that was flawed. And on the heels of this tour, we also have the Samuel Goldwyn film in 1959. The rights were announced as being purchased in 1957, I believe. It was a couple years prior, right after the tour ended. So that created a lot of discourse from the wider community whether this film needs making at all. And from a performer community, do they want to be involved in it? Because on one hand, probably more likely to get the job than other things, but on the other hand, ethically complicated and potentially causing a pigeonhole problem. The Great Performances documentary talked about how for many black actors at the time, it was a real career existential crisis and many people ended up turning roles down. Now the film leans very hard in the musical theater direction over the operatic direction, and all of the recitatives became dialogue. They cut it down to be 1 hour and 55 minutes long, and they definitely made massive cuts, but when I was watching it, I didn't feel like I was missing anything, so that was interesting. Porgy is played by Sidney Poitier, Bess by Dorothy Dandridge, and Brock Peters as Crown, and Sammy Davis Jr. is Sport in Life, but also most of them, if not all, were vocally dubbed, and you can tell when the switch happens, and it's really funny. It was also originally directed by Ruben Mamoulian, who you may remember as the guy who directed both the play and the opera on Broadway, but then at some point he was fired and or left due to creative differences, which happened to him often. He really struggled in Hollywood due to his particularity about films, but he did not end up seeing this one until the end. The movie was pretty much universally panned. Ira Gershwin really was not a fan of it, and sometime in the 1970s, it was pulled from circulation altogether for complex rights reasons. It is only technically legally available at the Library of Congress, but also a lot of people had it recorded on tape and put it on the internet, so it is no longer very hard to track down. I believe this is also the first major version, again based on limited extant images, where we see Porgy with any kind of leg brace. It is on his right leg, and he walks primarily on his knees with some sort of knee pad situation, and I believe the floor scooter thing appeared at one point, but maybe I'm mixing that up with something else. I watched a lot of Porgies in a very short period of time. After the failure of the movie, in addition to the rising conversations around civil rights and Black power, there was a focus on looking toward the future and not in the past. Academically, Porgy and Bess became something that was more often than not viewed as objectively a problem that should be relegated to the past. It was shelved as out of date and harmful. There were two revivals in 1961 and 1964, both at New York City Center, but they were both short and not majorly reported on. I wasn't able to find really any information on the matter, but I know they existed. And because of this, when Houston Grand Opera decided to stage it in 1976, they genuinely struggled to find people willing to do this show. This version made no major cuts or changes to the source material that I was able to find documented, though it is possible that this version is the standard upon which everything else is typically measured because it is the first one historically for so many people. This production completely revitalized the show, and it ultimately transferred to Broadway at the Uris Theater, which is now the Gershwin, beginning September 25th, 1976. Porgy is still on his knees in this production, and they would win both the Tony Award for Best Revival and the 1978 Grammy for Best Opera Recording. 9 years later, in 1985, Porgy and Bess premiered at the Metropolitan Opera for the very first time. It did genuinely take that long. This version was directed by Nathaniel Merrill, and it had 54 performances and 4 seasons between 1985 and 1990. Now, in 1986, we had a huge Porgy shift. This production is directed by Trevor Nunn. You may know him as the original director of Les Mis and Cats. We recently discussed him about chess on this channel. That was English. Hello, I've been here a long time. This version of Porgy and Bess was staged at Glyndebourne, an opera house in England, and would later be filmed in 1993 for the BBC. It says it is based on the complete score without any of the revisions made for the original Broadway production, but its runtime is only 3 hours. Maybe the original 4-hour production had 2 30-minute long intermissions, or bows took forever. I don't know, it's an opera, probably a combination. But this version leaned more operatic in styling, though it feels very theatrical in staging, based on the filmed version anyway. This production is also the first record I could find of Porgy using a cane or a crutch of any kind. In this version, he is on his feet, more or less, using one crutch and one walking stick, I think is the best way to describe that. His right leg is turned in and it drags a bit as he moves. This then becomes the relative standard for portrayals for Porgies going forward, except the random 2002 New York City Opera production where he's once again on his knees. We'll get to that one. There were things I had questions about in that version. I also don't believe he used a goat cart at all in this production. Anyway, one of my favorite things about this 1986-1993 version is that the piano during the first part of the opera was on a saloon piano, which I felt like it beautifully amplified the folky vibe of this score. It gave it a more ragtimey feel, like something these people would actually be playing in their local dance hall, which I really loved. The one thing I didn't love is at the end he throws down his crutch crutch and his walking stick and he limps off after Bess without either thing. Like, I prefer that to the throws down his cane and is magically cured image thing, but the imagery of somebody throwing down their medical aid and walking off into the sunset is one that comes up very often in disability media in a harmful way. It's also one that comes up often to insinuate that somebody is dying, which gives this an interesting potential double meaning. But overall, this version feels like a huge upgrade from all of the ones before that. The Great Performances documentary had some interesting interviews with Nunn, and he talked about how much he deferred to his performers and let them create the world that felt right to them, and you can really tell with the extant footage and with how everybody involved talks about it. Now in 1995, Houston Grand Opera sent their production on a second tour. This time it was directed and choreographed by Hope Clark, who was the first African-American to direct a professional US staging of Porgy and Bess a full 60 years after it premiered on Broadway. We then have the 2002 New York City Opera production, which is the first production that comes up if you go looking for a stage version in full of Porgy anywhere online. This version devolves a bit. Porgy's back on his knees, he's using a floor scooter, though he does have a brace on his right leg, implying that the imagery for this production came almost exclusively from the 1959 film. And at the end he tries to stand up to walk to find Bess, but he falls, and then they give him his cart, which he uses to go off instead. I overall was not a huge fan of this version. It also felt notable that of all of these characters, the only man with long hair and a do-rag who was dressed in a way that is technically period accurate but could also come across as modern was Crown. That felt deliberate in catering to particular stereotypes that I have not seen in any other production, and I thought it was an odd choice. 4 years later, in 2006, Trevor Nunn is back at it again, creating a new, specifically musical theater crafted production in collaboration with the Gershwin estates in the United Kingdom. This, of course, includes using dialogue instead of recitatives, also adding some pieces of the novel and play back into said dialogue, and they chose to use musical theater actors rather than opera singers. This version was decently reviewed, but it closed early, and I was not able to find any further information on it. The 2009 San Francisco Opera production also does not have a lot of information available, but in interviews with the cast, they noted a lot of the demeaning things were taken out of the script. I'm not sure specifically what changes they're referring to there, but this Porgy continues with the crutch trend, but he has no leg brace. And then we get to the 2011 production on Broadway that is my favorite, hands down, full stop. It had its initial tryout at ART in August of 2011, directed by Dan Paulus, with book adaptation by Pulitzer Prize-winning Susan Laurie Parks, and musical score adapted by Deidre Murray. This was the second production to ever adapt the show for musical theater in collaboration with the Gershwin estate, the first being the second Trevor Nunn production we just talked about. It transferred to Broadway at the Richard Rodgers Theater on January 12, 2012, running for 293 performances and closing on the 23rd of September 2012. This version was unsurprisingly incredibly controversial. Most notably, Stephen Sondheim wrote a letter to the editor of the New York Times based on interviews about what the changes of the show were going to be before the show even opened at ART, criticizing them for functionally bastardizing the work. He was not the only one to feel this way. This was just a very public example that's often used in reference to this production. And as I've deliberately tried to point out throughout this analysis, nearly every single version over the course of the show's entire history has made significant changes. And I have not come across major records of people getting heated about any of those changes at the time. And we also rework things like Shakespeare and Chekhov and Ibsen and Brecht and many others quite regularly. I don't really see this as being any different. Also importantly, this creative team is mostly of women of color. We're reworking something written by white and at the time white adjacent guys, which arguably makes this version even more valid and important in all the changes it is making. We will talk about the changes they made in just a moment, but just to wrap up the history piece first, it was nominated for 10 Tonys, winning for Best Revival of a Musical, and Audra McDonald winning for Best Performance by a Leading Actress. I think that was the first or second Tony Awards I ever watched. I remember her speech and the fact that one of her kids she brought with her as her date was about my age, all very vividly. Anyway, reviews were mixed for this version, but again, they took some really big swings with it, so that was kind of to be expected. I've spoken before in these analyses about how hard it is for me to be moved by anything I watch a digital recording of in the archives because it is digitally recorded, and also that place is cold and relatively uncomfortable, especially in the wintertime. So when I tell you I locked in on this show and I left literally shaking and I had to take the rest of the day off to process it, I very much mean that. First of all, Audra McDonald's performance alone was absolutely untouchable, and I don't know why. I mean, she has multiple Tonys, but we should just be handing her more. Also, the rest of the cast, unbelievably stacked. Norm Lewis as Porgy, Philip Boykin as Crown, Joshua Henry as Jake, Nikki Renee Daniels as Clara, just to name a few. And basically the approach to this production was to assume not that the narrative issues are those of racism, but that they're issues of dramaturgy. That these characters are stereotypes only because they have not been fleshed out to be whole people, and so that's what they tried to do. Many of the things that we've critiqued before are still in there, but they were placed within a wider context, which dilutes the issues a little bit. So for example, like, We still have Porgy's obsession with wanting to be a natural man, but it's also because he wants to take care of himself. We see that long before Bess has entered his life, he has been saving to get a leg brace and a better cane than the ones he has so that he's able to be more mobile on his own. They also got rid of the goat cart to give him more strength as a character. But because of this, he is no longer shifting from this sad disabled man who then gains strength and cares about himself because he has a woman to care for, but instead somebody who cares about himself because he does. And also, as a nice byproduct, it makes him a better partner to her, if that makes any sense. It's a small difference, but it's an important one. One article analyzing this version described it as helping to fix some of the emasculated Porgy of the opera who must count on a woman for everything narrative. They also changed the context of his song I Got Plenty of Nuttin' to imply that Nuttin is having gotten laid recently and how he is happy to have literally nothing else if it means that he's got that, which is a genius reframing of the song and now implies that they're like adults engaging in adult activities, which dispels some of the disability issues. This version also includes Bess's facial difference on her left cheek, and she added so much depth to this character, making it seem less like the traditional, oh, she can't control herself, her body just does what it wants, and instead leaning into how scared and alone she feels all the time and how that leads her open to being taken advantage of. They expanded the police brutality and taking Porgy by using his mobility issues against him, and when he returns, throwing his new expensive brace on the ground next to him, and then when he learns Bess is gone and asks for somebody to hand him his cane, nobody's willing to help him because they don't think he should go after her, so he crawls to get it himself, mimicking this on the knees, crawling on the ground imagery from the earlier versions, but this time he does it in a way that feels incredibly strong and purposeful and manly, for lack of a better way to put it, because of the intention behind it. And then he uses that crutch to walk off in the end. There are tons of other changes in this version I will not get into that expand out the characters or reframe stereotypical things as more multidimensional and fleshed out. And not only does that help the racism and the ableism issues in the text, but also makes the show flow really, really well, and the characters feel like real people that you connect to, making you so much more engaged in the show than I ever really was on any other version up until this point. I get that it was controversial. I know much of that has to do with how much people don't like change, and when they hear massive changes have been made to something they consider to be a masterpiece, they're inherently biased against it. I think looking at this from a minority scholar perspective it's just an absolute masterclass in both keeping something's original identity intact and completely refurbishing it to minimize the harm of the source material. It is truly, truly impressive. This production would go on tour in 2013, and there was an almost identical production of it at the Regent's Open Air Theatre in the UK as well. And then in 2019, we have the new Metropolitan Opera production that is the same one, staged in December and January of this year. This is how I learned that operas tend to recycle their same productions over and over again, which is completely foreign to me as a theater person, but I had watched and taken notes on the pro shot, and then I went to see the opera live the same day, and I realized I was watching the same show, just with different people, and I was really confused. Anyway, this version is directed by James Robinson. It seems like it began its life at the English National Opera in 2018 and then found its way over here. This version condenses the show a bit from 3 acts to 2, running 3 hours with 1 intermission. Its original run in September of 2019 was so successful they decided to add 3 more performances. It starred Eric Owens as Porgy and Angel Blue as Bess and won the Grammy for Best Opera Recording. And in this version, Porgy has the crutch and the walking stick with a leg brace on his right leg. They've also cut the goat cart. They've instead switched it to a little like seated scooter of sorts. It's basically just a soapbox on 3 wheels with a T-bar across the front. I can't lie, I was really excited to see a live goat, but I think narratively having the shift to less of a circus-esque form of transportation is the ideal choice, and I'm glad that it's been made more recently. I overall really like this production. It felt the most self-aware of its legacy of the bunch, I think is the best way to phrase that, at least of the operatic bunch. It's sort of hard to compare the theatricals and the operatics because the culture is so different. Also, Brittany Renee, who played Bess in this production this season that I saw, put every single ounce of her body into that role. It is very hard to do that level of highly physicalized acting that she was doing while singing a score like that. It was absolutely fantastic. I don't go to opera for acting performances. They have so much going on logistically, and I'm also sitting all the way in the back where the cheapest seats are, so the most I expect is like emotional tone coloration and voices, and that's it. But from her, I got this extensive character that really just made the show for me. And that has nothing to do with the topic at hand. I just wanted to appreciate how great she is. But that brings us to the end of adaptation bingo and into the final conclusion of the now what? What do we do from here? And I think a lot of the answers to that are not my place, so I'm not going to jump into that, but I will say from the perspective of having worked with another outdated opera, albeit a rock opera, being deeply locked into text because it is musicalized makes it incredibly difficult to update a piece in a way traditional musical theater or plays do not experience. I also think the issues here are very much structural and baked into the source material, not something a quick line change or two is going to do anything about, which again makes the 2011 production all the more astounding in what it was able to accomplish within the constraints of the source material. I would honestly love if that were the version that is licensed going forward. Also, because it's newer, maybe it wouldn't have the 2030 public domain issue. I'm really hung up on that. But one question I did have was about authentic casting, and by extension, what is the state of disability in the opera world today? And I talked to so many wonderful people, and they all basically said it's really far behind musical theater in its handling of minority issues, especially disability. And there are actually a few other reasons authentic casting is probably not possible for this particular case, but we'll talk about disability in the opera world first. The general vibe that I get is that because the operatic world is so insular and so heavily competitive, there is a general fear of doing anything that might show any form of weakness, for lack of a better way to phrase it. That's the word that is continuing to come up from performers. And that there are many cases of singers who were getting consistent work and then no longer got work after disclosing their disabilities. I spoke to multiple people who were in the opera world, experienced something disabling, and then just decided to pivot careers altogether because they were not able to get rehired afterward, even though vocally nothing major had changed. I also learned that most operatic sets don't have railings on platforms or staircases, which can create further safety issues for disabled performers. Not to say the theater is a whole lot better about that, but we do have rules on like railings on any highly elevated platform as well as certain heights of staircases. I don't know any more about potential set building safety things in the opera world. I just know that when I said, wait, you don't have rules about railings? In one interview, the response I got was wide eyes and you guys get rules about railings, which means it might be a wider safety issue beyond just railings. I tried to look into what potential guidelines they follow, especially because IATSE guidelines should cover both opera and musical theater, but I believe those guidelines more refer to crew safety conditions, and then the ANSI guidelines refer to set building safety for the actors. That's a rabbit hole that's sort of beside the point. I just include that in case those facts aren't quite accurate. It's just what I was told by a couple people with their experience in the opera industry. Now, one thing that I think is interesting with opera is that if you want to avoid traditional production style staging and just go in the concert direction as a career choice, that is viable and something that many people do. And it seems like the majority of out disabled opera performers have ended up down this path instead of doing full productions because discussions around accommodation and inclusion are not happening in theatrical performance spaces and because it's easier to accommodate yourself in a concert setting. Andrea Bocelli, who is blind, actually went this route for much of his career up until he became incredibly world famous, and then he appeared in a small handful of physical operas, but he did primarily stick to concerts his entire career. So it's okay for Andrea Bocelli to be disabled in opera performances. It's also okay for a character to be disabled if that's something the director envisions for the production. For example, a recent production of The Magic Flute at the Met, where the Queen of the Night, who's the villain in this particular opera, was put in a wheelchair, but it's not something that is expanded to include any more than half a handful of examples of actually disabled opera performers on stage. We kind of experience this in the musical theater world as well to some extent, where people are cool with disabled characters played by non-disabled people, but then kind of balk at casting disabled people. But it is something that we're having conversations about, and as I understand it, the opera world hasn't really gotten into having any of those conversations yet. So that already kind of crushes a lot of the idea of, oh, we could just authentically cast. That might help because it adds more depth and authenticity to a disabled role. There are probably tons of disabled operatic performers, but we only know a very few due to the concern around disclosing. And then on top of that, we also know that Porgy and Bess is already a huge pigeonholing issue for performers at only one level or two levels in the case of women of marginalization. So if there were somebody who could be authentically cast as Porgy, he would be asked to play Porgy for the rest of his career, and that's it, which is just woefully unfair. And then on top of this, you also add the logistics of opera itself. In the theatrical world, we're kind of flexible on voice type. Like, most people are fluid between multiple. I'm brought in for tenor roles as much as I am for mezzo-soprano roles, for example. I know people who are both baritones and tenors. I know people who are both mezzos and sopranos. We're kind of flexible. You can do whatever as long as you can sing it. But because opera is so technical, there are also more specific categories, and people don't really cross over between them all that often. And each role is very specifically set out by voice type, which means any Black disabled performer willing to play Porgy also has to be at a level to lead an entire opera and also has to be a bass baritone, which is a lot of things to ask concurrently. And I'm not saying that's impossible. I would like to see an authentically cast Porgy in the universe at some point one day. Same for an authentically disabled Bess, but the facial difference is already erased from so many productions, so I think tracking down a performer with a facial difference to do it feels even farther away as a possibility. But I don't think it's something that we can ever say, yeah, that's a thing that's easily doable and it should be the main discussion at hand, like we can with Curious Incident. I think it's maybe a little bit more possible in the musical theater realm because we're having these conversations. Musical theater Porgies tend to be a lot older than operatic ones do, so whoever it is will already have had a major career under their belt, mitigating much of the pigeonholing issue, but it is still deeply, deeply complicated. The other fix I usually offer for issues around disability and performance are ways of emoting things differently with more depth and different delivery within the given text. But because of the technicality of opera, as we talked about earlier, acting beyond vocal coloration is usually the last thing on the list in order of importance in performance. Over the course of however many Porgies I watched, I never quite picked up different emotions or acting beats between them because most performances leaned more into the operatic tradition of acting. Norm Lewis in 2011 was a completely different ballgame, but even he channeled much of what we've seen in Porgies before, so that's also not a huge option for modification here either, just given the constraints of the medium. I do think, given all of this context and the fact that every major change in the portrayal of Porgy's disability comes from musical theater and then transfers over to opera later, if we're going to make major casting and narrative shifts in this piece, it does need to be done from the theatrical side. Maybe Porgy and Bess hitting the public domain in 2030 will leave more space open for meaningful changes and reinterpretations of the work. Or maybe white people are going to start doing it all the time and that's what finally kills it off. Who's to say? I read interviews from black opera singers from 2011 where most of them said they are excited for when all people are allowed to sing this music because it's not fair that it's exclusive to black people. So I guess we'll see. I guess it's not just a casting choice, it's an entire culture that is inherently racially specific and would make no dramaturgical sense to put anyone else in the roles. Anyway, racial discussions have changed a lot since 2011, so maybe things have figured themselves out a little bit. We've got more things to worry about in the current climate than the theoreticals of what's going to happen with an opera in 2030 anyway. It's also incredibly important that we remember that it's not like the solution here isn't to fix Porgy and Bess, right? Like, we can produce other operas that tell black stories that are by black people. There are many of them, and none of them are produced nearly enough. It is easy to get caught up in focusing on how we can fix a historical piece, or at least make it a little bit better. But the historical first and only is no longer the only. And often half the solution is just diluting out that story with other better and more authentic ones. So why don't we do those instead? I'm otherwise going to leave this one here because I've been talking for I think 2.5 hours. I'm so tired. I'm really excited to hear all of your thoughts in the comments down below. Again, my Patreon and source list are linked below. Feel free to click any other buttons while you're down there. I would love to have you stick around. And as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.